Welcome. If you are just joining us on behalf of multiple organizations, we're welcoming you to the New Leisure Studies International Perspectives panel. Today's panel is focusing on racial inequities across the world. So it's delightful to see many of you here, or as much as we can see you. To get going on this Friday, why don't we ask you to introduce yourself and your Friday feeling in the chat. So let's see who's here. And so you can just type into the chat your name, where you're coming from, and how you're feeling today on this Friday, November 6th, to get us going and share a little bit. As you're doing that, I want to acknowledge the multiple organizations that are responsible for this panel that we're having. And those are 7 different organizations that are sponsoring this. We have the Australian and New Zealand Association for Leisure Studies, the Canadian Association for Leisure Studies, the China International Leisure Research Association, Leisure Studies Association, Sociology of Leisure, and the Academy of Leisure Sciences, and the World Leisure Organization. I'm tremendously honored to be here to bring this group together and moderate such a fantastic panel that we have. I'm Ingrid Schneider from the University of Minnesota, and I'm delighted to be able to chat with these 5 amazing individuals who are going to share their perspectives on racial inequities across the world. You read their full bios probably in the announcement for this webinar, so I won't go on about their expertise as it relates to race and ethnicity, but each and every one of them has a significant depth in this area. We have Dan Henhock from the University of Manitoba, Canada, Monica Stodolska from the University of Illinois here in the US, Harrison Pickney from Clemson University in the US, Arti Ratna from Solent in the UK, and Marie Young joining us from Western Cape University in Africa. So thank you to each of them. Just a little bit about today. What we're going to do is we've got 2 major questions we're going to ask each of our panelists to respond to, and then invite you to ask questions in the chat. Each of our panelists will have about 2 minutes to respond. Not a lot of time, we understand that, but enough to get a flavor and priority for our questions. Then we will have a quick poll and then have time for 1 or 2 questions, and we'll get to a second question. After that, you'll have time to ask a few questions as well, and we'll close out with a last word from each of our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pose our first question to the panelists, which is, what are the major issues related to race, ethnicity in your country, and how do they manifest themselves in recreation and leisure? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to invite Dan Henhock to start us off for about 2 minutes of conversation on this, and then he'll invite another panelist to speak. Dan, if you would be so kind.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I was dreading going first, but that's okay. I think I'm speaking from an Indigenous context here in Canada, and I think, we have a lot of inequities in Indigenous communities across the country, but inequities that are also very much based upon the context of where you're coming from. So, for example, I'm from the Six Nations Reserve, which is in Southern Ontario, which is part of a very urban area where our community has a very large population and large access to different opportunities. So our community actually has a lot of, I guess, access to different things. However, our community still suffers from sort of lack of funding in the community to be able to engage in different types of recreation and leisure activities. Contrast that with things like communities in the north or communities in rural or remote who have definitely issues of access to just basic recreation facilities and programs. And so that's very much a harsh reality for a lot of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Connecting that to broader issues around race and ethnicity, I think in Canada, particularly, there's race and ethnicity is still very much sort of stagnant in the sort of the dominant colonial tropes around what race and ethnicity is. And I think that really hinders how various marginalized communities are being sort of engaged with by government agencies and other types of organizations that are trying to provide recreation and leisure programming services for these communities. So, and I also think on the flip side of things, it's also difficult for um, people from these communities to even imagine or think about the types of recreation and leisure opportunities that they can engage in, because again, we have to race and ethnicity, the concepts are so there's so many tensions around what those things are, and I think a lot of people it's very difficult to sort of move beyond some of the very superficial ideas of how we think about race and ethnicity. So it's such a large problem and issue. It's hard to know where to begin, but I would say, from my perspective, I think an understanding of sort of Indigenous histories and Indigenous issues around colonialism would help maybe to help people understand some of these issues related to race and ethnicity. Is that, sorry, I didn't see you wave.
Perfect timing. Yes, please invite
Okay.
another.
So then I'll invite, I guess, in my screen, I'll invite Monica to answer next.
Thank you, Dan. I think my mic is off. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Ira, Ingrid, and the rest of the team for inviting us to speak today. It's really a pleasure to be a part of that seminar. Although I represent CERLI, which is China International Leisure Research Association, today I will talk from the US perspective, where my expertise is. So first of all, we live in very unusual times of the pandemic, times of the BLM movement, and the political polarization of our country. And racial tensions have not disappeared. Like some of them, some people predicted that once Obama would become president in 2008, we would live in a post-racial society. To the contrary, the last 4 years have accentuated divides in this country. They emboldened far-right extremism, and despite the shifts in administration that hopefully we're going to experience in January, they'll be front and center in our social and political landscape for many years to come. So this polarization of the society and the fact that racism has been normalized among large portions of our society are probably some of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome and address in the leisure field. And it's not only the overt racism that we'll have to struggle with at the individual level, but also the systemic racism in our institutions that will need to be addressed in research. There's no more middle America the way I see it, if it ever was. There's also a hidden America that professes values of tolerance and inclusion, but acts as if the last 50 years of progress have never happened. And we see it clearly in the discrepancy between the election projections and the actual voting patterns of the population, and how this new polarization of the American society will affect the ability of people of color to participate in leisure activities without fear of violence, racist confrontations, travel, and enjoy their leisure life is something that we as researchers should address. At the same time, however, progress has been made. When you look at the history of our country, the last 200 plus years, the dial has been moved towards the greater equity, mutual understanding, improvement in interracial relations. However, this progress has not been uniform. Across pockets of the population that are divided along socioeconomic, political, and geographic lines, it has been not uniform throughout history either. So we have seen in periods in our history of major transformational shifts, and there's been civil war and civil rights movement, and now I believe that we live in this major transformative period of the BLM movement that hopefully will usher new laws and new ways of thinking and shape new generations of Americans. And lastly, I'm sure I'm running out of time. There's the growing second generation of Latinx and Asian populations that should be researched in the future. And I will be happy to talk about it when I answer your question too.
Great, thank you. And do you want to pass it to another panelist?
Absolutely. Harrison, go ahead.
I knew you were going to do that, Monica.
Of course.
So I'll follow with the theme that Monica has started us. Of course, I'm also here in the United States. And I think I agree with very much what Monica has already stated. What I would add to that is that I think that we are at this pivotal point in our country where we recognize that in the next 20 years, next 20 to 25 years, the white majority will be the minority, the numerical minority. And so what we are experiencing, I think that this election, deals with this, and I think even we are seeing some of this around the pandemic, is this conversation of when it comes to public spaces, whose voice gets heard, whose will gets imposed, and I think that that's the bigger conversation that we are needing to sort of wrestle with, right? And so there is this. I had the privilege of working the polls this week, and the precinct that I was in, I was told that in 2016, about 24-25%, maybe pushing it, 25% of the precincts showed up. On the day of the election, 51% of the precincts showed up. Okay, and that was in addition to another 300 people that voted early, and this is a small precinct, right? So somewhere around 55% of the precinct. This is a rural area, largely to the left, and you had a number of people that came through and proudly announced that they were voting for the first time, people in their 40s and 50s, but they were voting out of fear that their voice, that their position was going to be lost, right? And fear that they were losing what they see as their country. And I think that this is where we are as a society, is trying to determine whose voice gets heard when it comes to the sharing of public spaces. And I tied in the pandemic as well, because there are conversations of, should facilities be open? Should they not be open? Should people be forced to wear masks? Should people not be forced to wear masks? And again, there are some racial hints to that as well, where some racial groups feel more strongly that I should not have to wear this. Or I should not have to be restricted. These are my rights. And I think that we are on the verge of having to decide, do we really become the democracy that we have claimed to be, or do we become South Africa, right? When we think about the history of South Africa, where the white majority was the numerical minority, but still remained the dominant voice. And the last thing that I would say to Monica's point about understanding the Latino community is recognizing that even when we look within that population, there are some groups like Cuban Americans, especially from South Florida, white Cuban Americans, where I'm from Miami, who overwhelmingly voted in one party. But then you had people, maybe Puerto Rican, who were voting in a different party. And so even understanding that these groups, we continue to say that they're not a monolith, but we don't act like it. We still are treating them as such. And I would even argue that we probably should, maybe even get rid of the term Latino and just start talking about Puerto Rican Americans or Mexican Americans. Thank you. Marie.
Okay, thank you, Harrison. Good evening, everyone, or it's evening for me. I'm from South Africa. Thank you very much for having me on your panel. This is very interesting. So I want to talk to you about what South Africa looks like, and how the different economic groups actually is still segregating people, and also people of race and ethnicity. So yes, South Africa is a beautiful country that's rich and in diverse cultures, beautiful cities and nature reserves, and we have a love for sport. Recreation is not a word that's well known amongst the people in South Africa, specifically because we have so many different ethnic groups, and also because not just do we have these groups, but they also speak 11 different languages in South Africa. So that in itself makes it very difficult to define and to, leisure and recreation. But if you speak about recreation, most people think it's sport. South Africa's democracy is still quite young in relation to other countries, but that left a legacy of, because of the democracy, the apartheid left a legacy of underdevelopment, inequality, high levels of poverty and unemployment. It also left high levels of disparity among citizens, and we have visible different economic classes, the rich upper class, the growing middle class, and that doesn't mean that they have enough income to actually go about and do leisure and recreation activities as they want to, because often they are the missed middle class and often forgotten. And then we have the lower income group, which is the high poverty group. And unfortunately, majority of them are still people from color. I would say 90% of these people in poverty-stricken areas are still people of color. Now, in these poverty-stricken areas, it affects the ethnic groups quite significantly because it causes many social economical problems. For instance, crime, health problems, and high level of unemployment. It's also evident, okay, almost done. So we've got these settlements called townships, and in these townships, people cannot participate in recreation and leisure in safe environments, purely because you have families or more than one family in one housing. So children roam in the streets or play in open fields that's often dumping grounds. These schools are not of high standard, and they often don't have the facilities. And if there is facilities in the communities, it's quite highly vandalized. So there's a lot of problems between the different socioeconomic groups, and then within these ethnic groups, that allows them to actually participate in recreational activities. So, Artie, over to you.
Yeah, no pressure there to follow up on all of you guys. But I guess some of what I want to say resonates with what others have said. And I think I wanted to talk specifically about the relationship between race, ethnicity, migration, and neo-nationalism, and to kind of think historically about how some of these issues are so deeply entrenched in the history of our nations. And this week I was teaching a class about migration, and I returned to the UK Tory politician Enoch Powell, who in the late 60s gave this very hate-filled speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, where he said, you know, the migrants from the former colonies would come to England and take over and swamp the country. And, you know, his language when he said, you know, you'd become the black man's whip, you know, that kind of language that was being used really perpetuated, like, you know, this hate discourse. And what it did is it took away from the retrenchment of the state. So with the increasing neoliberalization of the state, you know, social welfare began to be taken away. And so the poverty and working class issues of so many people, you know, they brought into the hate and kind of blamed the migrants. And I feel like this history, we shouldn't forget it, because in some ways it's rearing its ugly head even in recent times. So in the UK after Brexit, you know, the borders and things have changed, but now it's the fear of the European migrant and the degradation of our societies because of the proliferation of European migrants. But this kind of migrant hate, it's affecting even people who are long-term citizens of the country, and their belonging and citizenship is being questioned. And in my own research around sort of leisure and walking practices among South Asian communities in England, what I found was that even some of the South Asian middle class groups would perpetuate this hate talk against Eastern European communities as a way of justifying their own belonging and claims to citizenship. And what worries me is that this kind of divide and rule legacy of colonial times actually prevents us from asking the questions about the legacy of neo-nationalist thinking, but also how in leisure, you know, white supremacy operates in a way where, you know, various racial and ethnic minority groups, you know, are forever seen as lacking and different and not like us. And And in this environment, it's so hard to talk about racism and how racism manifests, because everybody already thinks they're anti-racist and racism is a thing of the past. So talking about whiteness and white privilege, what I find the reaction is often white tears and white grievance, and having to deal with that before you can actually then get into the issues of racism. And so it's this contradiction that I think is one of the key things that it's been really hard to kind of deal with racism in the UK because of these contradictions.
Thank you so very much. Really powerful statements and insights from each of you. We have a short one question poll for our participants. I believe you can see now. If someone could shake their head and indicate if they can see the poll. Can anyone see the poll? Not seeing the poll. All right, let's try that again. All right, so if you want to express how the issues that you heard raised with our panelists compare to those in your country. This poll will know the results right away. There's no recounting, there's no legal actions for it. It is just, we will know. 62% in at this point. This may prompt some questions. I'm going to close the poll and I've got everybody's vote in. And then I'm going to ask my tremendous support team, which consists of Irena Shariviska, Ami Choi, Jasmine Venader, Kelly Bricker, to field questions and share them with our panelists. But let me reveal our results here. So there seems to be some similarity in terms of the perceptions of these issues around the world. A few thought they were dissimilar, so that might pose a good question. But I'm now going to ask our tremendous support team to choose a question to ask our panelists from the many that might be forthcoming.
We actually don't have any questions so far, so we can move to the next question.
Okay, well, that works as well. So thank you. The next question is, what is the role of research in addressing these issues? And what constraints might exist to furthering research in this area? So we'll go ahead and start with Marie this time. And then Marie, you could pass the baton if you'd be so kind after about 2 minutes or so.
Okay, so I think in terms of the role of research, I think we really should use research to inform government and to inform policies. I think specifically if I look at South Africa, where people are still very ignorant about the meaning of leisure and what it can mean and the benefits of them. So we have a huge educational role in South Africa, so we really need to use research as the informative tool to do so. And in terms of the challenges, I think recreation and leisure is still very undervalued. And specifically, again, if I talk about South Africa, because it's not seen as a priority, there's not enough grants available for people to conduct research in this area. So if you do conduct research in this area, you have to either find a way to mollycoddle your application so that the focus is not on leisure, but on other issues in order to get the grants, in order to do the studies. And also the other problem is that because it's so undervalued, recreation has not been able to establish itself as a profession in South Africa. And it's people with very little or low educational levels that takes up the positions, and our students don't get the positions. So the interest to study recreation becomes less. And that affects the amount of people in South Africa that actually graduate and grow in the field of the academic field to actually be the advocates for recreation. So we actually have very few academics in South Africa in the field of leisure and recreation. So I think that that's basically the problem that we sit with, that we need to use research to inform government and policies, and as a result, advocate for leisure education, and advocate for professionalization of leisure and recreation.
Thank you so much. So fascinating, really. Do you want to pass it to someone?
Okay, let's go to Monica.
Thank you, Marie. So when I answered the first question, I talked about those two major topics, or three major topics, one being the sort of the transformative shifts in the society that we are experiencing right now, and the polarization of the society, the sort of the middle America disappearing. And I see them as springboards for, you know, a plethora of new research questions that can be addressed. For example, how the changes in interracial attitudes affect people's ability to participate in leisure of their choice. Very little has been done on the roles of leisure spaces and activities as sites of transformation and resistance to the continued oppression of people of color. And at the same time, you know, if you look at the last 30 years of research in our field, we always talk about under-participation. We've done a lot of research on constraints. So the way I see it, it's almost the deficiency approach. What is it that, you know, that we are lacking, how we can improve? But I think that we also need to look into the other side of the coin, meaning the leisure opportunities and styles of the growing middle class and upper class of racial and ethnic groups, the roles of leisure in facilitating success and inclusion. Also, the leisure styles and attitudes of the growing population of the second and third generation immigrants. Most of my research and research of many of my colleagues have focused on first generation newcomers, the change that people experience after they move to the United States, to Australia, to Western Europe. But if you look at the composition of the ethnic groups in this country, most of them are second and third generation immigrants. And so there's this growing group of mostly young and middle-aged people whose leisure styles and attitudes have not been explored to the extent that they could have been. Also, if you look at the projections for year 2050, the census projections, we are seeing a growing group of people who have a biracial or triracial ancestry, and very little research has been done on potential leisure styles and how they are being seen by the broader society in the United States. What are their leisure styles? What are the attitudes to leisure, and so on. Also, the question in my mind is, are we moving to an almost two-party, two-country system, sort of one moving towards the trajectory of inclusion and acceptance, and other sort of entrenched in the traditional values of the past? So this is sort of my dream paper when I think about it. It will be very interesting to explore the effect of political value orientation and worldviews on how people see, what are their views on inclusion in leisure spaces. And in terms of the constraints to research, no, I shouldn't talk about it. 10 seconds. Okay, Ingrid. Constraints on research. If you asked me that question on Monday, my answer would have been completely different than today. On Monday, prior to the elections, many of us, many universities have begun to canceling even diversity-related courses. Large pockets of funding have been pulled from diversity-related research. Diversity trainings have been banned. I'm sure it's much of that is going to be reversed past, January 20th. However, the bad genie is out of the bottle in a sense. So, and it's going to be really difficult to put it back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that quickly too. So do you want to choose a panelist?
Dan.
Thanks, Monica. A couple things as you were speaking and others were speaking. I think one of the things, my research has been very much around sort of colonialism and leisure, and how leisure has affected Indigenous peoples over a period of time, and how it continues to sort of perpetuate sort of neocolonialism. I would, one of the things I want to say is I think I'm not anti-leisure, but because leisure is ubiquitous throughout our societies. Even everyone who, even if you don't have a word for leisure, chances are you're engaged in some type of leisure, in terms of how we might categorize it. But I really come back to the idea that in order to understand sort of what's happening with regard to race and ethnicity and things like leisure, for at least from an Indigenous standpoint here in North America, that history is so important to understand sort of how things came to be, and can provide some insight in terms of how we've gotten to this point. For me, I think the role of research is very much about engaging people in a safe space where we can start to really unpack and address the tensions related to all these concepts and ideas and tensions that we just we don't have spaces to be able to articulate that, and that's, I think, what public spaces are for. And we have to bring out more narratives and stories about people's experiences, but we have to connect those to the broader, I think, geopolitical movements that are occurring throughout the world, particularly related to sort of the neoliberalization of societies and what that has meant. And I think the Indigenous example can really provide some of that clarity around what's happening, because we're living examples, I guess, of that, what's happened over the past 500 years of colonization. Constraints to research, I think, I'm sort of advocating for community-based participatory research. I think the constraints, though, are really related to the nature of the academy, time and funding, teaching loads. Like so many, I think the pandemic has exacerbated the ability of researchers to teach, and where we'd like to be focusing on a lot of research. So I think there's so many things that are affecting the ability of research to push forward on these ideas, but I'm trying not to be pessimistic. So anyway, I think that's it for me. I'll pass it off to Harrison.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think what I'm going to actually end up doing is really just reemphasizing a couple of things that Marie, Monica, and Dan have all said. I agree with Marie that one of the primary roles of research in addressing these issues is addressing, providing recommendations for policy, and moving past conducting research for the sake of, conducting research, or saying, hey, we have this wonderful knowledge. It's like, okay, great. Now, how do we solve real problems with it? And I think that that's where policy change is concerned. I also agree with Monica and her perspective that we have addressed this topic in a lot of ways from a deficiency approach, as opposed to really delving into understanding the, sort of the histories of these different groups. And one of the things that I challenge some of our students here at Clemson, especially our students that are, more park conservation, management, outdoor natural resource students, is, Monica referenced that, again, year 2050, when the white majority becomes the minority, the National Park Service, U.S. Forest, Department, they're all asking this question of how do we get people of color to enjoy the outdoors, or how do we get them to come and take advantage of our parks? And one of the things I challenge us to think about, and I think this is a constraint to our research, is, are we asking the right question? Is that really the critical question? Or is there a question that might be able to help us move the needle a little bit better? Maybe the question is, historically, how have African Americans enjoyed natural landscapes, and how do we reposition our parks to, to meet that purpose or that need, as opposed to what I think we are dealing with now? Hey, these are our parks, come and enjoy them as we have dictated that they should be enjoyed, and now we have to figure out why you don't want to come. And I think we get at that, through exactly what Dan suggested with the community-based participatory research, really thinking about what are our methods, what are the questions that we're asking that will allow us to, utilize a more critical lens in understanding how these various racial and ethnic populations are enjoying their free time and enjoying, open public spaces. And to Monica's point, are we looking at the differences from one generation to the next, right? And when you think about kids, from 10 years ago that grew up with a president that looked like them to kids from 30 years ago, their parents who never thought that a Black president was possible, these are all racial things that might influence the way in which they even approach, leisure. So not only is the group not necessarily one big group that identifies leisure as it relates to race in the same way, but also from one generation to the next. And I would even say kids today who are, consciously aware of what's going on in our country, they may see things very differently from kids 10 years ago as well, because they're living in a very different society. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Artie.
Yeah, so I want you to talk about sort of leisure studies as a discipline in the UK, and how in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, leisure studies as a discipline has really declined in focus, and it's very rarely taught in institutions across the UK. And therefore, because it doesn't exist as an undergraduate curriculum or a postgraduate curriculum, cohering research centres around leisure studies has also been quite difficult. But that's not to say it doesn't, exist in pockets, and there's not scholars and groups who are trying to keep leisure as a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary subject alive. And I think it's in those tensions of being a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary subject area that actually there's sites for really interesting knowledge and research to be done. One of the things I was going to say, and others have said this, within the sort of neoliberal turn in academic communities, one of the things now is trying to get funding to do research. And so with leisure not being necessarily on the map, funding becomes also quite problematic. But for me, I just feel like in this moment in time, leisure as a public good and something that's socially significant as a site to bring people together, who increasingly because of COVID have been socially isolated. We know the death rates among BME communities have been particularly impacted. I hope that there will be a rejuvenation of government funding and therefore then scholarly funding on studies of leisure. It reminds me of the amazing work of scholars such as Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, when they talked about concepts such as everyday multiculture, and how, I was speaking about the rhetoric of hate speech earlier on, but how in our everyday local spaces, people do rub alongside one another. And, leisure has potential to create a commons. So like, for example, in my walking research, a lot of the people who were gardening together, across their different migratory stories and histories and cultural heritage, the gardening was something that brought them together. Now, I think in leisure studies, and in 2017, myself and others contributed to a special issue around neo-nationalism. And one of the arguments we made is that there needs to be deeper and greater critical discussion of race and racism. And part of me thinks we need to address some of the uncomfortable truths. So around, anti-racism and white supremacy and white privilege in sport, but also another uncomfortable truth, how in our academic communities, whiteness is still taken for granted. And so we do have many scholars who have privilege because of their whiteness, who might be writing about social injustices and racism. But there is a difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. And I think Harrison made that point before. And that, in our neoliberal communities, giving lip service to racism through your research is one thing, but when you need to kind of create cultures of solidarity and resistance within your academic spaces, sometimes I ask, where are those scholars who are writing about social injustice through leisure? Sometimes they're not there, and that's really hard.
Thank you for sharing and those important questions. And yeah, we're seeing a lot of questioning and showing up or not, I would say, in our institutions. I know a big significant topic at the University of Minnesota, that's for sure. All right, I know we have at least a couple of questions. Perhaps we could take a question. I think Kelly is going to share one, and then each of the panelists, if you choose to respond, can do that. Kelly?
Thank you. I'm curious we're certainly seeing a lot of disparities with this global pandemic in our country, in the United States. I'm wondering how leisure has been impacted in various countries around the world due to the global pandemic.
I can answer. In South Africa, because we have these quite different kind of communities, in the middle class and upper socioeconomic classes, because of the strict lockdown, people were able to confine their leisure to their houses and their homes, and the environment around the house in their residential area. And I did a small study where I actually asked what people and their children were doing, and I saw a lot of family time activities happening. But I also saw the flip side in those families, where members had to work and children were left to do what they want to, or just they withdrew themselves totally socially, and now they struggle to integrate socially again as the lockdown regulations eases. While in these poverty-stricken areas, people just went on doing whatever they did before the lockdown or before the pandemic, as if the pandemic doesn't exist. And because there's a lot of unsocial activities like drug abuse, teenage pregnancy, school dropout, it seems those kind of activities pursued, there was no difference in those kind of activities. Also because they cannot stay in their houses, they stay on top of one another. I mean, their houses might be three by 3 square meters. So there's no space for them to do something in their house. So of course the kids are going to play in the street. Of course they're going to play in the parks. Of course there will not be any social distancing. So there's really these two different worlds in South Africa, if you can put it that way, of how people spend their time during the pandemic in leisure activities.
I think that to follow up on Marie's point, which is absolutely correct, I think from our perspective, the pandemic just amplified the existing inequalities in access to leisure spaces and leisure resources. And, from the very beginning, when it started in February or March, I've been seeing those headlines, we are all in the same boat and we are in this together. No, we are not. Seeing people recreating on their boats and private beaches and golf courses where you can socially distance. Obviously, it is not the same than people who live in the community that we study that has access to one 12-acre park for 91,000 people. So the sort of messages perpetuated from top down that we are all in this together and we are suffering equally. No, we are not. And we are seeing it in the hospitalization rates and death rates. And so the things that we knew existed now sort of came to the forefront.
Yeah. One thing that I would say also, though, is that to one extent, I don't know that we are able to fully answer the question of the impact, because at least at our university, I think a lot of other universities are in this position. We're not allowed to go out and collect data right now to understand the impact, right? But there are enough reports that are, being written of, bikes being sold out, so for a long time it was hard to get a bike. I think puppy adoptions were through the roof at one point, and then there was some, to Ingrid's point that she just, put in the chat box about, observational data, some different, social groups that I'm a part of online, social media groups, you start seeing, specifically, we're talking about race, you actually start seeing a, I think Marie mentioned this first, that there was this increase in, family time. And so we're seeing that, but we're also seeing in certain parts of the country, an increase in the number of African-Americans who are, taking up hiking and spending that time outside on trails as a way of getting out, getting the family active. And unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, this would be great to study, but we're not allowed to leave campus, and we're not allowed to spend money because, budget.
I just wanted to say, across race and ethnicity, I think one of the most socially damaging things has been the rise of domestic violence, and so many women and children who therefore then have not been able to seek communities of support or access leisure spaces to, develop networks of care, etc. And I think that's been quite heartbreaking. And I echo everything that was said about how public leisure spaces kind of show deeper inequalities around class. I was going to make more of a point about the cultural industries, so around arts, dance, and theatres, and how in our local community, some of these are, very far and few between, depending on, I guess, on the class context of where you live. But there's been a complete decline in closure of these. But yet at the same time, the government have risked COVID by opening some aspects of the hospitality industry. So I really worry about the future of our cultural industries. And the reason I think I worry about that is because without public funding, some of these things like arts and dance in the community, which are particularly important as part of cultural identity and pride. So where I live in the north of England, there's a very big Caribbean community. So not having access to the spaces of dance for young people, has been impactful. And I really hope there's money that's put into rejuvenating those spaces so that, communities can return to, spaces of collectivity, pride, and spaces of support.
Thanks for sharing. We do have another question that I'd love to bring to the panelists. I think Ami Choi will be asking it, and maybe if a panelist who hasn't spoken could speak to it if it works for them.
Yes, so this question is from Tassif. The question is, COVID-19 has exposed passive racial fault lines in otherwise inclusive societies like Canada. Call for localism over tourism for an understandable reason, social distancing, exacerbated such fault lines. What's your take on it?
I don't know if I understood the question, because in the context of Canada, I think some of the fault lines are deeply rooted and embedded in the history of Canada as a colonial settler context. And, there's, for example, a growing South Asian community in Canada, and, in leisure spaces, access for those communities is having to negotiate quite complex white nationalism alongside then the sort of colonial settler history. But there's probably others here that can speak to that better than me, I think. Dan Henhawk.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around the question as well. I think if it's meaning that, have we promoted localism or local tourism over broader tourism in Canada, perhaps? Is that exposing sort of racial fault lines? Again, it's a hard thing, I think, to sort of answer. I think, again, maybe from an Indigenous perspective, it maybe is exacerbating it a bit because, Indigenous communities who are engaged in tourism, may or may not have seen an increase or a decrease in people coming to engage in their offerings. And again, whether that's related to biases related to Indigenous communities right now, because Indigenous communities are suffering from COVID-19 a bit more than other communities. I don't know.
I think in some parts of the US anyway, people do not want non-locals there. And that might be exacerbating some internal racial conflicts as well. The person is further clarifying, a few exploit crisis moments to substantiate their otherwise unsubstantiated dislikes toward outgroups. Perhaps such outgroups are the tourists, especially with visible contrasts. So thank you for those questions. Well, we're coming toward the end of our time together, and I would like to take this moment, one, to thank the amazing panelists for tremendous insights and ideas that they've shared. So thank you, each and every one of you, Dan, Monica, Harrison, Artie, and Marie. Some of you are up very late and it's very different timeframes than the hosting. So thank you for that. And we want to provide an opportunity to share a parting thought. So literally a minute. If there's a last word or comment or direction you want to suggest or share. And I asked for volunteers to go first. And maybe we should start with Artie because she's gone last twice, but it's up to her.
Okay, no, that's fine. I was thinking back to why we all came together and the social charge that was circulated as a collective statement. And I just want to come back to that social charge because I wonder if we should be doing, something more, something else to create change. And, we've been having a discussion in the UK in various societies and organizations about how we as societies and organizations work more equitably, transparently, inclusively, and to make our spaces more open. And we're beginning to do the work of making that happen, but it's still a challenge. So I don't know if anyone else wants to speak about the social charge.
No, I didn't want to speak about the social charge, but I just think, while we have quite similar issues in our countries, and also quite different issues, and South Africa has come quite a way in terms of dealing with ethnicity and racism and different, trying to mend relationships between different racial groups. We still have a long way to go because we had a lot of racial incidences over the past few months that is really breaking down a lot of barriers. But I still remain that if we can use our knowledge and use leisure and recreation as a means to keep on trying to heal and keep on trying to mend and transform our communities, that is something we should strive for.
I think we live in very interesting times that helped to sort of distill and amplify some of the issues with which we as a society here in the United States and abroad as well have struggled with for decades, for generations. Race, racism, issues of belonging, issues of white supremacy, issues of privilege and privilege with access to healthcare and natural environments and open spaces and leisure resources. And so I think we have an opportunity to step back and look at those topics sort of with a fresh eye and maybe come up with different research questions and different solutions to the ones we studied for decades and for generations now. So that goes back to Harrison's point that maybe we've been asking wrong questions all along, or maybe we should just rethink the ways we approach research and approach issues.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing I would say also to that, because I want to reemphasize something that I heard Dan say, is while we're asking those questions, thinking about who we're calling upon to help answer those questions. And this idea that sometimes in our efforts as researchers to address some of these inequities, we may be guilty of repeating some of the challenges that we're trying to address, because we'll go in, we'll utilize a community for the sake of collecting our data, and then we just sort of leave them without necessarily empowering them in any kind of way. And I think this is a pivotal time, to Monica's point, as we're taking that step back to start thinking also about what is our approach to our research, and do we continue to sort of drop off some surveys, hand out a few gift cards and leave, or do we really start to do the sort of the heavy lifting of sitting down, building relationships with these communities of color, building relationships with these communities that have been oppressed, and partner with them and empower them to to help us in addressing these issues through research and teaching them how to become researchers in their own right.
The only thing that I want to add, I'm moving into, I'm trying to understand land-based education. That's a very imperfect term, and it's been sort of thrown around with other terms like place-based education, and it relates to traditional indigenous ecological knowledge and things like that. And I'm really interested in not only sort of indigenous ways of being in Canada and North America, but I'm also sort of interested in terms of what other cultures and peoples around the world think about sort of different ways of being in the world that can sort of bring forward ideas that can counteract some of the things that we're seeing related to neoliberalization and global capitalism and all those types of things. So I think it's really interesting time, obviously, where we can maybe try and explore and stretch these ideas around what we think about leisure and what we think about being in the world. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you for each of your parting thoughts and your tremendous insights and good questions that you brought to us today. Another thank you to the team supporting this and the organization supporting this. Thank you, Kelly, Ami, and Irana, Jasmine as well. So you have been listening to and hopefully inspired by are these great folks, and you can tune in a few weeks as well. On December 4th, we'll be hosting another webinar focused on climate change and leisure. And we have set our dates, but topics to be determined for 2021, but looking at the first week of each of the February, March, and April. So thank you again. Do take care and be well. Wishing you all peace through these challenging times. Thank you to the organizing and supporting organizations.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. I was like on the panel.
Bye.
Be well. Really appreciate it.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stop recording.